I'm not speaking on this, just so you know. Pastor John asked me to come up here and just repeat my message about books because I'm not a very loud person. So apparently some people in the back didn't hear me. What? Exactly. So as most of you guys know, I've been collecting books so that when my kids come in on the first day of school, everyone's blessed with a book with maybe an encouraging word in it, and that people are praying for them throughout the school year. Originally, the deadline for those books was today, but we've had a lot going on.
Yes, you have.
And then I haven't been here to remind people, so I'm extending that to next week. So if you signed up for a child to give a book to them and to pray for them, I just ask that you bring that in by next Sunday.
Thank you.
Good morning. Okay. Pastor asked me to read from Psalms 23 to 27, 107, 23 to 27. Okay. They that go down to the sea in ships, that do business in great waters, these see the works of the Lord and his wonders in the deep. For he commandeth and raiseth the stormy wind, which lifteth up the waves thereof. They mount up to the heaven, they go down again to the depths. Their soul is melted because of trouble. They reel to and fro and stagger like a drunken man and are at their wits' end.
You guys ready? I'm so glad to be here this morning. I'd like you to grab a piece of paper and just jot down some ideas. I don't want to add any or try to add any validity to what I'm saying, but I was amazed that almost from the second that Miss Terry started singing to the songs that she had chosen. Now, we hadn't talked, have we, Miss Terry? And yet it's almost everything that she said and sang is directly in line. And then Don got up here and everything that he said, and I didn't call Don or anything, and it just reiterates. And then Adam said the same thing, and then several others. So I'm assuming then, I don't know this always, but I'm assuming then this is what we might call a rhema word. There's two Greek words for the word, W-O-R-D. One is logos, and it's the written word. And the other one is a rhema. And it literally means a spoken word where God makes that situation alive to each one of us. I assume then God has a rhema word for us, or someone in here needs to hear what is about to be said. So I want to say to you, I want to go down and give you as much as I can. And I'm very humbled by, isn't it amazing that God knows what we need to hear? Each one of us, he knows why you're here. He knows what you're thinking. And so the verses of Scripture has been called, if you will, the Mariner's Psalm. And isn't that how much of the music and everything was about ships? Isn't that amazing? Don's issue on the, what'd you call that? I had never heard that term. And then he talked about the heaviness that sometimes we are loaded down with. And that's true, isn't it? No matter who you are, you can have a lot going on in your life. And it just was amazing to me that back and forth, and then yet we're going to look at what is called the Mariner's Psalm. It's Psalms 107. It is the only one of its kind. And you have to wonder then why David, the author, would even spend any time trying to write about the experience of being on a boat. Except for the issue is he's not so concerned what it's like to be on a boat, but he's going to make a comparison. He's saying to you and I that the similarities that are on a boat can be the same similarities that can be in life. And that's true, isn't it? The only thing, he's not talking about just any time being on a boat. He's talking about the times when it's in rough seas. And that makes all the difference in the world, doesn't it? One of the shows that I love to watch is The Deadliest Catch. Let me see. Deadly Catch, people love it. Now, come on, it's okay to admit that in church. But it's basically about where these boats from Alaska go out and they do certain types of crabbing at different times of the year. And every now and then you see one of those boats go out in the wrong time of the year on the Bering Sea, only to have to face these tremendous waves. The other day I was watching it, and they said that at that period it was one of the worst times, and they had to face 50-foot swells. Now, I don't even know what that is like, but I know one thing, that would not be my intention. Would it be yours? I've been on a boat with a little small swells, and I got sick, but I can't imagine being on a boat with 50-foot swells. You're going up and down. So these verses basically are saying to you and I, we're going to discuss the issue then, what it's like to be in life and having that same effect. The verse says in verse 23, they go down to the ship, they go down to do business, and that's the whole issue. We're just trying to live life, right? And then it goes on to say, verse 24, that they see the work of the Lord and his wonders in the deep. And that's amazing to me, how that you can see God out there sometimes, but you can't see God in here sometimes. Yes, isn't it amazing? This morning, when I got out of the car, I had my binoculars, and I'm so glad that building is gone out here. Ricky, I appreciate it. The building right there, the little chicken shed. And so, but I got a chance to look at the mountains, and let me tell you, they are absolutely beautiful. The idea here is that they're trying to do business, they're trying to live life, and all of a sudden, in the middle of living life, they are hit with this enormous swells, and they don't know what's going to happen. Now, I want you to number on your notes. We have the time. I want you to number 1 through 6, and we're going to do them all, even if I just read them to you. Because if God is speaking to our church, we want to be as tender as we can. I gave you the last two last Sunday, and so I'll just read them again so that you'll have them in your notes. The idea here is they have done everything that they knew to do in order to save the ship and their lives. And I love how that verse ends. In verse 27, they reel to and fro like drunken men and stagger, but they're just at their wits end. I don't know about you, but that's a profound statement, isn't it? The idea there in the Hebrew, the word wits in the Hebrew is our personal skilled wisdom. It is what we have learned through the years to deal with the problems that come our way. That's the idea for the word wits. You know, when you say to somebody, keep your wits about you, it's the ideal of making sure that you're thinking it out and trying to make the decisions that's best to make it through what you're going through. The idea here is then they have exhausted all of their experience. They've exhausted all of what they thought would carry them through the storm, and yet they're finding themselves sinking. And so I love this verse. It simply says they did everything they could mentally and only ended up thinking to themselves, we're not going to make it. That same story is repeated in Matthew 8, verse 25 through 27. Remember that when Jesus was sleeping on the boat and the disciples ran into a storm? You remember that one? And they yelled to Jesus and they said to him, don't you care that we are about to perish? And he arose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. And the men marveled, saying, what manner is this, that even the winds and the waves obey him? So the real issue is, what do you do when you're going through something like this? And let me say, Carol and I was talking about this. Sometimes I'm afraid that TV evangelism has made the assumption that we don't go through there if we do the right things, right? You can kind of get that hint that all you got to do is just go to church, give it tithing, and you'll never go through anything. That's just not being fair with people, right? I remember one day my secretary at our church in Oklahoma, who I dearly loved, she found herself, and I don't even know how to say this, going through a tough financial situation. And in the middle of that deep financial burden. For some reason, she decided to buy a brand new $35,000 car. Within that year, her finances kept going worse, and she kept hearing people say, all you have to do is tithe in church, and God's going to give you 100-fold, and you'll never have any lack. And she ended up losing her car. She asked me, Pastor, I did what was right. I tithed like everybody told me. I gave to certain televangelists, and yet God allowed. Why did God do this to me? We all go through things, right? Nod your head. It's at different levels. What's the word? Everybody help me out. What is the word that I gave you? And I'm going to remind you that everyone goes through things. What is it? Sonder, S-O-N-D-E-R. It's the word that everyone you meet, no matter how rich, how poor, whatever they think they have, everyone goes through a time in their life when they're wondering if they're going to make it. Now, let me go into this as quick as I can because I want to give some answers. Then what do we do when we go through that? And please, what you're going through is different than what I go through. Would you agree with that? And the way that we handle it, the way that we handle pressure and problems is different for everyone. So don't try blanketing your statement by saying, do it the way that I do it. You do the way you do it, and hopefully you will come out successful on the other end. Number one, I said this last week, I'm just going to hit it, and that is remind ourselves during those times to trust in God. Right? And we'll get into that later on. If you're here and you say, I know that's nice, how do we do it? I will show you in about 4 months from now, 3 months from now. I have a sermon on how to trust, and we'll deal with that issue. But number one, you have to learn somehow in the middle of that situation, when everything seems to be rocking and reeling, then I tell you, you have to ask yourself the question, God, what do I do to trust you? The second thing I said is that you have to leave room for the supernatural. You have to. You can't become so die-hard by the problems that are coming your way that you forget that God is able to do amazing things. Isn't that right? The one thing that does bother me, and it's always bothered me, and that is this: you never know what God is going to do. Do you really? Honestly, come on. Come on, let's just be honest with it. In honesty, there's times when I have believed God and it worked out wonderful. There's times when I tried to believe Him and it didn't turn out at that moment the way that I thought it would turn. Come on, right? Good preaching, Pastor. I'm going to be balanced here. I don't care if you're impressed with what I said. I'm just saying at times you've got to be able to say, God, I'm going to do this right now, and I'm going to trust you that somehow in the midst of that, you're going to perform the supernatural. My son called me and he asked that question this week. He said, John, Dad, how does the United Methodist stand on the issue of miracles? He's joining a denomination that many of the pastors are what we call sensational. I don't know, that's probably not the same word we're meaning, but the new group of people who do not believe in the modern day work of the Holy Spirit and the modern day work of miracles are called sensationalists. And there's a whole denomination that says they happened years ago, but when God finished writing the Bible and gave us the Bible, then we don't have any more miracles. Let me just say I immensely disagree with that. And I'm just saying, I'm not saying I'm right. I'm just saying through my philosophical, theological view that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And that somehow in the midst of that, He's able to do. Now, here we're going to start with the ones that we didn't give. The next thing you have to do is keep the promises that God has made to you in mind. You remember we sang the songs about it, just most of the things that we said. We started realizing Psalms 107 verse 20 says this: He sent His word and it healed them. The word there, word, W-O-R-D, is a spoken word. It's a word made alive to you. It is when you're seeking God about this issue. And by the way, life can really have a vacillation, can it? Can it really not? I mean, right? Come on, nod your head like you understand. I mean, you can be up one day and down the next. You can be doing fantastic today, and you think you are the king of the world, and then, oh my God, the next day you get a note from somebody, and all of a sudden everything changes. I hate that sometimes, don't you? Because you think you got it all together and everything is fine. You're on the ship and you got your thing loaded. Everything is perfect. And all of a sudden you're bragging and you're doing wonderful. And it's not wrong. And then all of a sudden, slam, the waves hit. My thing is, and I don't know if this is true of anyone else, but sometimes it's the constant bombardment of one thing after another that gets to me. It's not the one problem, right? Sometimes I just wish, okay, Lord, I've been through my problem for the month. I'm going to go on. I mean, no, that doesn't happen. Sometimes you're hit with one problem, and before you can get your breath, the ship slams back down. Before you realize it, that baby is out of the water, and you're thinking to yourself, I don't know what's going to happen. I'm telling you, the way that you remain steady through those situations, you lock your mind into the promises of God. Let me make a couple quick statements here. My father-in-law, I wish I could somehow say how much he means to me. My father-in-law, Carol's daddy, is a pastor. And I remember years ago as a young person watching him go through the most unbelievable fall, physically and financially, I've ever seen. He was pastoring a church, and at that moment, some of the decisions of his children were not the best. Now, not Carol marrying me, that was the better. And one of his sons-in-law talked him into loaning money against his home. I say this, and I think Carol would be honest, that their family was very Christian. Dad was a pastor in a ultra-holiness conservative Wesleyan church. And then for some reason, her family married a bunch of hellions, me included. Now, I say that with honesty. There's 3 girls, and all 3 of the girls married my family. Each one of the girls married a member of our family. Now, you picture that. Yeah, don't look too hard. It was shortly after that one of the sons-in-laws asked him, said, oh, just borrow $20,000 or $30,000 against your home. I'll pay you right back as soon as this comes in. And how many know? Come on. They don't come in. So he borrowed the money, ended up going bankrupt. Church started going down because it started taking its toll on him. And pretty soon he found himself not only physically bankrupt, financially bankrupt, but inside. The ship was just being shredded. One day, he and I were very close throughout his entire life. I went to him one day and I said, Brother Boutwell, how you doing? And he said these words I'll never forget. He said, I'm hanging to what God promised me. God promised me the salvation of my children. He promised me the dedication of my sons-in-laws and you boys. Right? So what do? Abraham said this in Romans, he staggered not at the promise of God through unbelief, but was fully persuaded what God was promised, he was able to perform. He was able. So he was looking at the simple God and saying, God, you promised this, and somehow as I'm riding this wave, not knowing the future, not knowing how things are going to turn out, I simply am reminding myself of your promise. I want to stop. You can tell I'm not yelling a lot today because this is really a tough issue with me. There was times in my life I almost gave up. Have you ever almost given up? And by the way, I wish I could do a sermon. I can't, but I'd like to do a sermon called When Did You Stop Believing? Because I believe a lot of times we do that, don't we? We give up on situations. We don't announce it in church. We don't say anything. We just do like the rich young ruler who, when Jesus said you have to sell all and give it away and then come and follow me, and the scripture says he just kind of quietly, reserved, not saying a lot, just kind of walked into the back, off the scene. See, what happens when you say to yourself, I'm not for sure what God is going to do. I'm telling you, the promise of God, keep the promise of God. If I were you, when God gives you a word, put it on your refrigerator. And remind yourself every single day of what God promised, right? Because the scripture says in first that God is able to perform everything that he promised. He told Moses, he said, not one word of the promise failed. Not the promise. He said, not one word of what I have said to you is not going to come to pass. And so when you're going up and down and you don't know what's going to happen, you just simply say to yourself consistently over and over again, by what you promised is going to come to pass. Let me go to number 4. I see I'm going better this time, aren't I? Keep in mind the sovereignty of God. What do I mean by that? The sovereignty of God simply means that God has all the power and authority when it comes to our life. I want to say that again. Look at Psalms 107, verse 28. Now watch this. This is what shocked me about this whole experience of them being in this storm. Look at verse 28. Tell me if you catch this. Verse 28 says, and they cried unto the Lord in their trouble, and he bringeth them out of their distress. He maketh the storms a calm. Who's in control? God. No, I don't know if I should say this, but at times things are led in our life, and yet God is behind the whole situation, and whenever he says it's time for that to end, God's got the power to make our life come to some kind of calmness. Isn't that amazing? He did the same thing in Matthew 8, where they were thinking they were going to drown, and he steps up from a sleep, and that, by the way, doesn't that just kind of irk you? Have you ever wondered, Lord, don't you care what I'm going through? Yeah. And Jesus steps up, and he just simply looks at the waves and says, hey, quiet. Peace, be still. There's a verse I love in Revelations that said this: I am the first and the last, the Alpha and the Omega. I'm the beginning and the end, and I have the keys. Right? So at any given second, when I want to change, you keep in mind that I'm God. You're not in control. I do believe, I hate to say this, I don't want to say this, I think sometimes God leads us into situations so that he can show himself strong on our behalf. Not always. There's times that he's saying to us, I want you to be to where you can't work it out. I want you into that position that you look up to me and say, God, I'm looking to you. The sovereignty of God's power. I want to say this, and just if you will put this in your notes, I'm not going to go through each one of them. But this whole chapter gives 6 sovereign issues of God's power. I won't read them to you or anything, but it's amazing. There's these 6 areas in here where it's like God saying, I'm sovereign in this area. I have all the power. I'll just quote to you a couple of them. The first one's in verses 4 and 5. When times are difficult, he says, guess who's in control still? What? Come on. He is. Then the next verse, 107, verse 10, and please, I want to be tender when I say this, but the verse literally means that he's the God of issues when you're lonely and you're depressed. That's one heck of a boat to be in, isn't it? Have you ever known anyone that struggles with emotional depression? Got quiet, didn't it? It's not easy, is it? Cheer up. Don't worry about it. Everything's going to be okay. Trust the Lord, and it's not them on their boat, right? Don't you hate it when people can tell you how to live their life when they're not on your boat? Huh? One of the things, I was pastoring a church in Indiana, and we had a lady who had never had any children, was trying to tell all the other ladies how they should raise their children. Don't you love people like that? She didn't mean it mean. I loved her. We still love her. But it was so funny because she was telling us back then, she says, here's how you do it. Mothers, all you have to do, and this is for real, she says, buy your children a different style of doll. What? Yeah, buy them an Indian doll, an African-American doll, a Jewish doll. And what you'll do is you'll raise children that love everybody and they'll never want to hurt or do anything wrong. We should buy those dolls, huh? When Melissa had her children, she found out that dolls don't sometimes work. I remember we were over the house after she had the children, and she was yelling at one of them. I mean, yelling. I don't mean just loud. I'm talking like, get over here, I tell you right where you stand. I said, Melissa, where's his doll? I'm sorry, I had to do that. We have to believe in the sovereign power of God. There's one that I marked down, and I did a lot of study, and I won't bother you with it now. One of them that's dealing is the dealing of the power of sin in your life. If you read this chapter, you'll find out that it says they sinned, and God allowed this. 6 verses later, they sinned, and God allowed this. Now I'm going to say something, but even sin can't separate us from God. Not saying it can't puts a wedge in your relationship a little bit, but I'm saying sin can't stop God from loving you, right? I was pastoring a church, and won't get into this, but there was a drug addict in Harrisonburg, and probably at that time one of the largest drug dealers in the community. And he strode into one of the services that I was preaching at, and I could tell, man, this guy I did not want to mess with. He looked like Godzilla in tennis shoes. I mean, he is massive. When I say that, I've asked him to come here and speak to you. Big neck, he has really no neck, just a head and a body. He's just massive. And in that service, he gave his life to Christ. And since then, God has put his life back together. Our God is still sovereignly powerful, even in sin in our life. Right? Because sometimes you can be overwhelmed with your own sins. Right? I'm never going to do that again. I'm never going to be negative. I'm never going to speak mean. And then the next thing you do, bang, you do it again. Come on. How many's ever been on that boat? I promise I'll never do it again. Number 5. See, I'm keeping good time. Remember the power of your words. Remember the power of your words. Listen to Psalms 107, verse 1. It says, oh, give thanks unto the Lord, for he is good, and his mercy endureth forever. Let the redeemed of the Lord say so. Let the redeemed of the Lord say so. Somehow you just can't get swallowed up with just the constant negative conversation to yourself. Let me put some words here, and then I'll go to number 6. It's not wrong to say what you're feeling. I think, here's what I've heard in the TV anymore.